Welcome to this Bitcoin price update for the month of September. Please make sure to speak to a financial advisor before buying any Bitcoin. So, when you look at the long term Bitcoin price, we see the price discovery of a whole new asset class. However, there has been a number of speculative bubbles in between, and actually, the last two speculative bubbles had new all-time highs spaced by exactly 16 quarters, which is pretty remarkable. Each of these speculative bubbles coincided with a sudden increase in the amount of new money coming into Bitcoin from a new available market of speculators. I go into quite a bit of detail of how that happened with each cycle in my last video, if you go and look at that on my YouTube channel. In terms of the latest speculative price bubble, this I've assigned this to be mostly to do with ETFs and actually public companies buying Bitcoin. You can see that in this slide where we have ETFs buying and companies buying being in quite a clear trend this year. And then also in terms of the ETFs, they've only been around since the beginning of 2024. And you can quite clearly see that where there were large inflows into the ETFs, that corresponded to new pumps in the Bitcoin price. Also, at the beginning of 2024, the ETFs didn't have any Bitcoin, and now they have 7% of Bitcoin. Plus, we have the company's holdings here. So you can see here how this new money coming into Bitcoin quite clearly explains the most recent price increase over the last couple of years. So in August, the price of Bitcoin dropped about 10%. So actually, 10% isn't really that much of a difference in Bitcoin land or even S&P land really these days. However, amongst the Bitcoin community, there was certainly quite a bit of heartache in August. In my previous video update, I spoke about my chill channel. However, the price of Bitcoin has definitely broken out of that channel, so I can get rid of that now. And really, I'm left with these two stop losses I've got here. These are two long-term technical trends that I've been using to try and predict when this Bitcoin bull market will be over. The first one is actually based on the logarithmic chart. So here we have a long-term logarithmic chart on Bitcoin. You can see it removes a lot of the noise and gives a much more kind of reassuring and based long-term view on the Bitcoin price. And we can see a clear trend here. And this very convincing trend, which is linear on the logarithmic chart, becomes actually exponential when I switch over to the linear chart. And so that this blue line here, that's this blue line here where you see the arrow. And so that's my first kind of fallback position for Bitcoin, because if I saw this trend broken, that for me is kind of a clear red flag. And we're still above that. In fact, you could say that the next 2 months are going to be very exciting because it's make it or break it time for Bitcoin. And then this line here, this is the 52-week moving average for Bitcoin, which has been a really solid support going back to 2023. And so that's kind of my final test for if the current bull market's broken. And this red line here is where I've extrapolated out that data, and that really would be like my final defense line. Here I've got the logarithmic chart zoomed in, and you can see both of those lines here as well. This really is put up or shut up time for Bitcoin. Here I've lined up the previous Bitcoin cycles, and 2017 really was a classic Bitcoin cycle, whereas 2020 was a bit of a funny one because where that purple line is here. This was where China banned Bitcoin mining. And I think that really kind of messed up the bull run. This year, I've aligned this current cycle with these previous ones. And to be honest, it looks a lot more like a classic Bitcoin cycle than it does the 2020 one. And we're still following this historical trend where we are. I've got here all of the Bitcoin in existence split out by the age of the Bitcoin. Earlier in the year, as you'll see in my previous videos, we saw some Bitcoin migrate from the one cycle hodlers to liquid unknown Bitcoin. And then we saw some Bitcoin drift from the unknown liquid Bitcoin into the ETFs and the private companies. In August, we didn't really see anything other than the amount of retail on exchanges increased by 0.1 million. Now, the actual data on exchange graph shows this continual drop in the amount of Bitcoin owned on exchanges. So the only way I can explain why it went up by 0.1 million is that I'm guessing the people who collate this data, which is CoinGlass, they actually included a new source of data when totting up the total and then applied it backwards. That's the only way I can explain how, despite this trend, the amount of Bitcoin increased by 0.1 million. So really, that's like a data anomaly. And overall, there's not really much happening. Here I've got the age of Bitcoin up against the different sources, and I've been tracking it since January, and no major trend really, other than the amount held by private companies going up. This is, of course, very low resolution data though. And here we have from the block.co, we saw here a loss in momentum of the amount of the assets under management of ETFs, but they still own slightly more Bitcoin. So here I've got more like the raw data. And here you can quite clearly see the loss of momentum in ETF buying. Most of the year, it's been a trend of more buying. Here we have a loss of momentum. And the same for companies buying Bitcoin, even MicroStrategy. Here we've got similar data, but from the in the raw data from CoinGlass. And generally, okay, we saw Bitcoin mining companies got more and public companies, but generally a lost momentum. And you can see that here a lot more clearly, where I've been stacking up this data every month, and you can see from the green, and you can see from the decrease in the amount of green that we see a definite we're definitely running into a loss of momentum in August. MicroStrategy raised 0.4 billion to buy Bitcoin, but again, compared with earlier in the year, it's a loss of momentum. The country's holdings stayed the same. Here's the private companies. Here's the public companies' ownership, and the only notable increases was Metaplanet, the Japanese company, who increased their Bitcoin holders by 17% to 20,000. And finally, private companies where there was no movement. Here's my KPI for our current speculative bubble in the price of Bitcoin. And in terms of the cycle, we're still in trend for a classic Bitcoin bull market. So that's why we have the green light there. In terms of the ETFs, the amount of buying has stalled. So that's now in amber. In terms of private companies, their flows was only 2%. So again, that's in amber. This is, I think, the first time that all of these aren't green this year. And this really just reflects how the bull market has stalled in the month of April. In terms of MicroStrategy, it's stalled there too. And here's my kind of too good to be true meters. And we don't really have to pay much attention to them at this time. So overall, it's quite clear that in the month of August, the amount of buying of Bitcoin lost momentum in terms of the ETFs and the companies. It's seen quite clearly here, and you can see that quite clearly with this data set here as well. The next few months really are going to be put up or shut up time for Bitcoin. We're very close to this technical trend line here, which I've derived from the logarithmic chart, and we're also kind of close to what would be my final fallback position, which would be the 52-week moving average. Of course, these stop losses are based on the assumption that someone's a long-term investor with, say, something like a 20 to 40,000 average buy price. Myself, I only do long-term investments, so that's what this channel is designed for, not traders. And for the last year, I've been telling everyone that I wouldn't buy Bitcoin because the possible upsides only maybe like a 2x, whereas there's huge downside risk. Please remember that all of my analysis is based on the concept of a long-term investor with a much lower average buy price. So that completes this video. Make sure you speak to a financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Hope you enjoyed this video and speak to you at the next one. I do videos like this one just for fun as a hobby. It's for entertainment purposes only. Always consult a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decision.